Then they set out for home, a queer party, for Franz rode on to tell the news. Dan and Toby led the way. Then came Nan in the strong arms of Silas, who considered her the smartest little baggage he ever saw, and teased her all the way home about her pranks. Mr. Bear would let no one carry Rob but himself, and the little fellow, refreshed by sleep, sat up and chattered gaily, feeling himself a hero, while his mother went beside him, holding on to any part of his precious little body that came handy, and never tired of hearing him say, "I knew Mar would come," or seeing him lean down to kiss her and put a plump berry into her mouth, "'cause I picked 'em all for you." The moon shone out just as they reached the avenue, and all the boys came shouting to meet them, so the lost lambs were born in triumph and safety, and landed in the dining room, where the unromantic little things demanded supper instead of preferring kisses and caresses. They were set down to bread and milk, while the entire household stood round to gaze upon them. Nan soon recovered her spirits, and recounted her perils with a relish now that they were all over. Rob seemed absorbed in his food, but put down his spoon all of a sudden and set up a doleful roar. "My precious, why do you cry?" asked his mother, who still hung over him. "I'm crying 'cause I was lost," bawled Rob, trying to squeeze out a tear and failing entirely. "But you are found now. Nan says you didn't cry out in the field, and I was glad you were such a brave boy." "I was so busy being frightened I didn't have any time then, but I want to cry now, 'cause I don't like to be lost," explained Rob, struggling with sleep, emotion, and a mouthful of bread and milk. The boys set up such a laugh at this funny way of making up for lost time that Rob stopped to look at them, and the merriment was so infectious that, after a surprised stare, he burst out into a merry "ha-ha!" and beat his spoon upon the table as if he enjoyed the joke immensely. "It is 10 o'clock. Into bed, every man of you," said Mr. Bear, looking at his watch. "And thank heaven there will be no empty ones tonight," added Mrs. Bear, watching with full eyes Robbie going up in his father's arms, and Nan, escorted by Daisy and Demi, who considered her the most interesting heroine of their collection. "Poor Aunt Jo is so tired she ought to be carried up herself," said gentle Franz, putting his arm round her as she paused at the stair foot, looking quite exhausted by her fright and long walk. "Let's make an armchair," proposed Tommy. "No, thank you, my lads, but somebody may lend me a shoulder to lean on," answered Mrs. Jo. Me, and half a dozen jostled one another, all eager to be chosen, for there was something in the pale motherly face that touched the warm hearts under the round jackets. Seeing that they considered it an honor, Mrs. Jo gave it to the one who had earned it, and nobody grumbled when she put her arm on Dan's broad shoulder, saying, with a look that made him color up with pride and pleasure, "He found the children, so I think he must help me up." Dan felt richly rewarded for his evening's work, not only that he was chosen from all the rest to go proudly up bearing the lamp, but because Mrs. Jo said heartily, "Good night, my boy. God bless you," as he left her at her door. "I wish I was your boy," said Dan, who felt as if danger and trouble had somehow brought him nearer than ever to her. "You shall be my oldest son," and she sealed her promise with a kiss that made Dan hers entirely. Little Rob was all right next day, but Nan had a headache, and lay on Mother Bear's sofa with cold cream upon her scratched face. Her remorse was quite gone, and she evidently thought being lost rather a fine amusement. Mrs. Jo was not pleased with this state of things, and had no desire to have her children led from the paths of virtue, or her pupils lying round loose in huckleberry fields. So she talked soberly to Nan, and tried to impress upon her mind the difference between liberty and license, telling several tales to enforce her lecture. She had not decided how to punish Nan, but one of these stories suggested a way, and as Mrs. Joe liked odd penalties, she tried it. "All children run away," pleaded Nan, as if it was as natural and necessary a thing as measles or whooping cough. "Not all, and some who do run away don't get found again," answered Mrs. Joe. "Didn't you do it yourself?" asked Nan, whose keen little eyes saw some traces of a kindred spirit in the serious lady who was sewing so morally before her. Mrs. Joe laughed and owned that she did. "Tell about it," demanded Nan, feeling that she was getting the upper hand in the discussion. Mrs. Joe saw that and sobered down at once, saying with a remorseful shake of the head, "I did it a good many times, and led my poor mother rather a hard life with my pranks, till she cured me." "How?" And Nan sat up with a face full of interest. "I had a pair of new shoes once, and wanted to show them, so, though I was told not to leave the garden, I ran away and was wandering about all day. It was in the city, and why I wasn't killed I don't know. Such a time as I had! I frolicked in the park with dogs, sailed boats in the back bay with strange boys, dined with a little Irish beggar girl on salt fish and potatoes, and was found at last fast asleep on a doorstep, with my arms round a great dog. It was late in the evening, and I was as dirty as a little pig, and the new shoes were worn out. I had traveled so far." "How nice!" cried Nan, looking all ready to go and do it herself. It was not nice next day, and Mrs. Joe tried to keep her eyes from betraying how much she enjoyed the memory of her early capers. "Did your mother whip you?" asked Nan curiously. "She never whipped me but once, and then she begged my pardon, or I don't think I should ever have forgiven her. It hurt my feelings so much." "Why did she beg your pardon? My father don't." "Because when she had done it, I turned around and said, 'Well, you are mad yourself, and ought to be whipped as much as me.' She looked at me a minute, then her anger all died out, and she said, as if ashamed, 'You are right, Joe. I am angry, and why should I punish you for being in a passion when I set you such a bad example? Forgive me, dear, and let us try to help one another in a better way.' I never forgot it, and it did me more good than a dozen rods." Nan sat thoughtfully turning the little cold cream jar for a minute, and Mrs. Joe said nothing, but let that idea get well into the busy little mind that was so quick to see and feel what went on about her. "I like that," said Nan presently, and her face looked less elfish with its sharp eyes, inquisitive nose, and mischievous mouth. "What did your mother do to you when you ran away that time?" "She tied me up to the bedpost with a long string so that I could not go out of the room, and there I stayed all day with the little worn-out shoes hanging up before me to remind me of my fault." "I should think that would cure anybody," cried Nan, who loved her liberty above all things. "It did cure me, and I think it will you, so I am going to try it," said Mrs. Joe, suddenly taking a ball of strong twine out of a drawer in her work table. Nan looked as if she was decidedly getting the worst of the argument now, and sat feeling much crestfallen while Mrs. Joe tied one end round her waist and the other to the arm of the sofa, saying, as she finished, "I don't like to tie you up like a naughty little dog, but if you don't remember any better than a dog, I must treat you like one." "I'd just as lief be tied up as not. I like to play dog," and Nan put on a don't care face and began to growl and grovel on the floor. Mrs. Joe took no notice, but leaving a book or two and a handkerchief to hem, she went away and left Miss Nan to her own devices. This was not agreeable, and after sitting a moment, she tried to untie the cord, but it was fastened in the belt of her apron behind, so she began on the knot at the other end. It soon came loose, and gathering it up, Nan was about to get out of the window when she heard Mrs. Joe say to somebody as she passed through the hall, "No, I don't think she will run away now. She is an honorable little girl and knows that I do it to help her." In a minute, Nan whisked back, tied herself up, and began to sew violently. Rob came in a moment after and was so charmed with the new punishment that he got a jump rope and tethered himself to the other arm of the sofa in the most social manner. "I got lost too, so I ought to be tied up as much as Nan," he explained to his mother when she saw the new captive. "I'm not sure that you don't deserve a little punishment, for you knew it was wrong to go far away from the rest." "Nan took me," began Rob, willing to enjoy the novel penalty, but not willing to take the blame. "You needn't have gone. You have got a conscience, though you are a little boy, and you must learn to mind it." "Well, my conscience didn't prick me a bit when she said, 'Let's get over the wall,'" answered Rob, quoting one of Demi's expressions. "Did you stop to see if it did?" "No." "Then you cannot tell." "I guess it's such a little conscience that it don't prick hard enough for me to feel it," added Rob, after thinking over the matter for a minute. "We must sharpen it up. It's bad to have a dull conscience. So you may stay here till dinner time and talk about it with Nan. I trust you both not to untie yourselves till I say the word." "No, we won't," said both, feeling a certain sense of virtue in helping to punish themselves. For an hour they were very good. Then they grew tired of one room and longed to get out. Never had the hall seemed so inviting. Even the little bedroom acquired a sudden interest, and they would gladly have gone in and played tent with the curtains of the best bed. The open windows drove them wild because they could not reach them, and the outer world seemed so beautiful they wondered how they ever found the heart to say it was dull. Nan pined for a race round the lawn, and Rob remembered with dismay that he had not fed his dog that morning and wondered what poor Pollux would do. They watched the clock, and Nan did some nice calculations in minutes and seconds, while Rob learned to tell all the hours between 8 and 1 so well that he never forgot them. It was maddening to smell the dinner, to know that there was to be succotash and huckleberry pudding, and to feel that they would not be on the spot to secure good helps of both. When Mary Ann began to set the table, they nearly cut themselves in two trying to see what meat there was to be, and Nan offered to help her make the beds if she would only see that she had lots of sauce on her pudding. When the boys came bursting out of school, they found the children tugging at their halters like a pair of restive little colts, and were much edified, as well as amused, by the sequel to the exciting adventures of the night. "Untie me now, Marmar. My conscience will prick like a pin next time. I know it will," said Rob, as the bell rang and Teddy came to look at him with sorrowful surprise. "We shall see," answered his mother, setting him free. He took a good run down the hall, back through the dining room, and brought up beside Nan, quite beaming with virtuous satisfaction. "I'll bring her dinner to her, may I?" he asked, pitying his fellow captive. "That's my kind little son. Yes, pull out the table and get a chair." And Mrs. Joe hurried away to quell the ardor of the others, who were always in a raging state of hunger at noon. Nan ate alone, and spent a long afternoon attached to the sofa. Mrs. Bear lengthened her bonds so that she could look out of the window, and there she stood, watching the boys play, and all the little summer creatures enjoying their liberty. Daisy had a picnic for the dolls on the lawn, so that Nan might see the fun if she could not join in it. Tommy turned his best somersaults to console her. Demi sat on the steps reading aloud to himself, which amused Nan a good deal, and Dan brought a little tree toad to show her as the most delicate attention in his power. But nothing atoned for the loss of freedom, and a few hours of confinement taught Nan how precious it was. A good many thoughts went through the little head that lay on the window-sill during the last quiet hour when all the children went to the brook to see Emil's new ship launched. She was to have christened it, and had depended on smashing a tiny bottle of currant wine over the prow as it was named Josephine in honor of Mrs. Bear. Now she had lost her chance, and Daisy wouldn't do it half so well. Tears rose to her eyes as she remembered that it was all her own fault, and she said aloud, addressing a fat bee who was rolling about in the yellow heart of a rose just under the window, "If you have run away, you'd better go right home and tell your mother you are sorry, and never do so any more." "I am glad to hear you give him such good advice, and I think he has taken it," said Mrs. Joe, smiling, as the bee spread his dusty wings and flew away. Nan brushed off a bright drop or two that shone on the window-sill, and nestled against her friend as she took her on her knee, adding kindly, for she had seen the little drops and knew what they meant, "Do you think my mother's cure for running away a good one?" "Yes, ma'am," answered Nan, quite subdued by her quiet day. "I hope I shall not have to try it again." "I guess not," and Nan looked up with such an earnest little face that Mrs. Joe felt satisfied and said no more, for she liked to have her penalties do their own work, and did not spoil the effect by too much moralizing. Here Rob appeared, bearing with infinite care what Asia called a sarser pie, meaning one baked in a saucer. "It's made out of some of my berries, and I'm going to give you half at supper time," he announced, with a flourish. "What makes you, when I'm so naughty?" asked Nan, meekly. "Because we got lost together. You ain't going to be naughty again, are you?" "Never," said Nan, with great decision. "Oh, goody! Now let's go and get Mary Ann to cut this for us, all ready to eat. It's most tea time." And Rob beckoned with the delicious little pie. Nan started to follow, then stopped and said, "I forgot, I can't go." "Try and see," said Mrs. Bear, who had quietly untied the cord sash while she had been talking. Nan saw that she was free, and with one tempestuous kiss to Mrs. Joe, she was off like a hummingbird, followed by Robbie, dribbling huckleberry juice as he ran.